Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here, to see such a big crowd, so congratulations to the organisers, and thank you for inviting me. It is, as I said, a very big pleasure to be here, but I've also just had a wonderful 10-day holiday in Brazil, so hopefully I won't be too rusty and will remember some data protection. The topic of my talk this morning is rethinking the foundations of data protection law. Or, as you can see from this slide, I've reworked that slightly to call it data protection through the looking glass. And so, for those of you who are literary fans, you'll know that in the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, the book by Lewis Carroll, Alice goes through the looking glass to a parallel world where everything is inverted or turned on its head. And in essence, what I want to suggest this morning is that having had almost 50 years of experience in Europe with data protection and 25 years in the EU, it's time for us to turn data protection on its head. And so, in particular, I want to make three main claims. So, the first is that core data protection principles, which you see replicated in the Brazilian law, remain solid and sound in a digital era, but they are put under a lot of pressure due to the exponential increase in personal data processing that we see, what Fleur Johns has called the data deluge. So we're faced with a tsunami of data, and this is putting pressure on data protection rules. As a result, I think we need to see two changes happen in terms of data protection legislation. One is an internal change to data protection law, and that is a move away from the idea of putting pressure on individuals to take responsibility for their own data, owning their data, exercising their rights, and instead putting emphasis on the enforcement of data protection rules and on the responsibilities of data protection controllers. And I think there's some mechanisms in the Brazilian law for this, but also a lot more mechanisms in the General Data Protection Regulation, or the EU's GDPR, on this. Because I would say, in addition to looking through the looking glass, if we look backwards in Europe, the biggest flaw we have seen with data protection law is that while the law on the books is very solid, the law in practice has been very ineffective. And I'll talk through some of the reasons why it has been so ineffective in practice over the course of this discussion. But the third claim I want to make is that in addition to turning data protection on its head and putting more emphasis on strategic enforcement, we also need to look beyond data protection regulation to other areas of law, potentially regulation around consumer protection, but equally what I will talk about today is competition law and data-driven mergers and the impact that that then has on rights like data protection and privacy. And so I think it's only when you look at this big picture that you can kind of deliver effective data protection. So, this morning, I will speak to you quite a bit about the EU data protection framework. Firstly, because that's where I have expertise, but secondly, because I think the Brazilian law aligns very clearly with the rights-based regimes, data protection regimes, that you see indicated here on the slide. So I've recently completed a big piece of comparative work on global data protection regimes, and you can see that broadly speaking, you can divide systems into rights-based models, which are founded on fundamental rights and give individuals rights, and more economic models, where the primary aim is to ensure the free flow of personal data. And of course, these aren't completely separate aims, because the GDPR and Convention 108 also seek to ensure the free flow of data, but it's about where emphasis is put. And reading through the Brazilian law, I would suggest that it falls more into the rights-based camp of data protection frameworks. The other reason why I think the European experience could be relevant and could provide some kind of cautionary tales for the Brazilian law is because the basic framework of the system is the same as the GDPR. And so if you look at the Brazilian law, what you see is that it applies broadly to personal data, which is processed. So it applies to all personal data processing with quite limited exceptions. And it doesn't prevent personal data processing. Rather, it allows personal data processing, provided that you keep in mind some safeguards. One of the interesting ones in the Brazilian framework is good faith. You keep in mind some safeguards, and that you show you have a legal justification. That could be consent, but that could be contract, or the public interest, or legitimate interests. And so in this way, you see that it's a kind of system of checks and balances. And in that system of checks and balances, it gives rights to individuals and places responsibilities on data controllers. And so in this sense, again, the Brazilian law is very much aligned to modernized Convention 108 from the Council of Europe and the EU General Data Protection Regulation in its scheme. So then looking at the European experience, well, you could see that the first European law at EU level was introduced in 1995. And following a very contentious legislative process with an awful lot of lobbying, more so than any other piece of EU legislation in history, the GDPR was adopted in 2016 and entered into force last year. And you see a former European data protection supervisor note that in spite of all of the innovation in the GDPR, the core principles around legal basis, around safeguards, remain the same. So we've retained all of the familiar basic concepts and principles, they continue to exist, but they're subject to some clarifications and small changes. This, I think, in principle is true, but once you dig a little bit further in the GDPR, you can see that actually the core principles surrounding rights and responsibilities haven't changed significantly, but there is a new layer of regulation that is introduced, a new layer of meta-regulation, which I'll come back to later. In particular, the introduction of a principle of accountability. And this is another principle that applies to data controllers in an effort to make them think in a systematic, organizational way about how to protect personal data. So that's an additional layer of protection, which you also see in the Brazilian law, but which didn't exist in the previous generation of European data protection laws. And building on top of that, you see stronger enforcement mechanisms, significant administrative fines, up to 4% of annual global turnover. And that was really, of course, what grabbed the headlines. But beyond that, there are some smaller enforcement mechanisms that are likely to make a bigger difference. In particular, the introduction of collective redress, and I'll come back to that again later. So you can see that the Brazilian law shares quite a lot in common with these European data protection frameworks. It's rights-based, it's based on a system of checks and balances, and it has adopted all of the innovations that you see in the most recent kind of round of legislative change in the EU. So why then do I ask us to rethink the foundations of data protection law? Well, one thing which I think you see quite clearly in the GDPR is references to its fundamental rights status. And that, I think, has increased since 1995. And the reason why I say that is that in 2009, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights acquired binding force. And so this is a charter of rights which contains not only a right to respect for private life, but in addition, a right to data protection. Now, this might seem natural to you, but such a right, for instance, exists in some constitutions in Europe, the Portuguese constitution and the Slovenian constitution, for example. But in other countries, I'm Irish, in Ireland, for instance, this is a very foreign concept. The idea that data protection is anything more than a compliance issue. So to consolidate it as a right starts to beg some interesting questions. What is the added value of this right beyond the right to privacy or the right to respect for private life? What does this right do that privacy does not? And so in thinking about this, and sorry, if I revert to the text of the right, you'll see that it sets out a general principle. Everyone has the right to respect for private life. It also identifies some elements of data protection law and points to them. So for instance, the idea that data must be fairly processed, the idea that you need to have a legal basis. It identifies the right of access to data. But what about other rights, such as the right to delete data? Do they not have a fundamental right status? What are we to infer from the provision's silence as to these other rights in the data protection framework? And then I think what is probably quite interesting from a Brazilian perspective is that compliance has to be ensured by an independent authority. And that is an element of the Charter right to data protection. So that procedural element is as important as the substantive rules in the data protection framework. So this has provoked a lot of discussion about what we want from this right to data protection. And the Charter of Fundamental Rights refers to the essence of each and every right. So the first question is, well, what is the essence of the right to data protection? And here I think people split into two camps. The Court of Justice of the EU, so the highest court, has indicated that this could be data security. So how might that work in practice? Well, you might, for instance, have a government force a company to ensure that encrypted technologies have a backdoor that can be routed around when law enforcement wants access to data. Well, that, you could argue, violates the essence of the right to data protection by impacting on data security. But others argue that the essence of data protection is the idea of informational self-determination. And this is what I want to focus on today, because this is something that's also mentioned in Article 2 of the Brazilian law. So informed self-determination and the concepts of dignity and personality are referred to. So how attached should we be to that concept of informed self-determination? But you can see, as I said, that there are other key elements just outside of the core of the right to data protection, which are mentioned in the right, in Article 8, and then others which are not mentioned at all. So one of the big questions in the coming years will be, what exactly is this right to data protection, and how will it impact the interpretation of this legal framework? But as I said, there is a right to data protection in addition to a right to privacy. And so in thinking about how to separate these two things out, you can think of elements of privacy that relate in no way to data. So for instance, physical privacy. Somebody standing at your window and looking at you getting out of the shower relates in no way to data if that's not recorded in any way, if it's just a simple peeping Tom kind of privacy violation. So that would be a violation of the right to respect for private life, but not a violation of the right to data protection. But the question is, are there things that would breach the right to data protection that wouldn't constitute a privacy violation? And here I think, and I apologize because this is my poor use of PowerPoint, but these rights are in fact very heavily overlapping. So this picture is kind of inaccurate. I just couldn't make them overlap anymore. So these rights are in fact now almost completely overlapping. But yet, if you look at data protection law, you see that it guarantees protection for more types of information than the right to respect for private life, because ordinarily it applies to data which has been made public. And I note that in the Brazilian law, you don't need consent for data processing when it has been manifestly made public by the data subject, which I think is going to be a very, very contentious provision in the law. Because when can we say in a digital context that you've manifestly made something public? But the other safeguards in the law apply. So the rules give protection, and the right gives protection to publicly available data, whereas the right to respect for private life often requires a reasonable expectation of privacy in a particular situation. But the other way I think data protection is perhaps broader is that it gives individuals rights to control their data in circumstances which would not exist under privacy law. The clear example of this in the Brazilian law and in the EU law is the right to data portability. My right to switch data providers or cloud computing providers or email providers isn't something that is intrinsically linked to my private life, but it is intrinsically linked to my ability to control my data. Which is why, if you look at the GDPR, we start to see a lot of references to control over personal data. So there are some explicit references in the GDPR, which didn't exist previously. So just one example here in one of the recitals, which are the non-binding provisions at the beginning. You see that a personal data breach, if not addressed, can cause material and non-material damages, such as a loss of control over personal data. So this is referred to time and again, the need for individuals to be able to control their personal data. But I think more importantly, it is implicit in many of the provisions in the GDPR. And so if we think of the idea of control, I think we instinctively think of consent. But of course, that's a fallacy in the Brazilian and the GDPR, the Brazilian law and the GDPR, because consent is only one legal basis. You don't always need to have consent. You can rely on another legitimate reason for processing personal data. So consent is one manifestation of this informational self-determination, but I think that this is more obvious when you look at the bundle of micro-rights. And this is a term used by Daniel Lemaitre, a French researcher, where he says, the GDPR gives you a bundle of micro-rights over your personal information. And again, you see these in the Brazilian law. The right to access, the right to delete, the right to port your information. In the EU, very controversially, the right to be forgotten. And all of these are mini manifestations of this idea of control over personal data. And as I said, the charter right itself, when you look at the wording, it doesn't mention informational self-determination, but it does seem to be heavily influenced by a decision of the German Constitutional Court in 1983, which was based on the constitutional rights to dignity and personality in the German Basic Law, and it extracted this right to informational self-determination from those constitutional rights. So all in all, what you see is an increased emphasis on control over personal data by individuals in the General Data Protection Regulation. And I think that's replicated to a large extent in the Brazilian law. However, I would urge some caution about this because, as is by now well documented, control is, I think, a necessary element of data protection law, but it is not a sufficient element of data protection law. And by that I mean that we can't rely on individuals to control their own data. The reason why I say this is twofold. So first of all, we can imagine a whole series of practical reasons why we can't control our own data. So, sorry, but before saying that, I guess, pushed to its logical conclusion, the idea of control over personal data would bring us close to a property right in personal data. And that is categorically not what the EU data protection framework gives. Although, again, I do note that Article 17 of the Brazilian law speaks of ownership of data. And initially, when the GDPR was adopted, the commissioners, the political commissioners responsible for its adoption spoke of ownership of data. But it seems those results are very hard to find, or those statements are very hard to find on the internet now, because they realize that, in fact, the law doesn't give you ownership over data, it gives you control in certain limited circumstances. And so if you look to business models that you see emerging, well, across the world really, so kind of personal information management systems, and this is a quite extreme example called commodify. This is the idea that you can take your data and sell it online. So you can see here you save your data, they analyze your data, and then you license your data to them. So they're not claiming it's an ownership model, it's more like an intellectual property right that you have over your data. But again, here I think we need to be quite cautious in thinking about these business models. Why? Because the concept of informational self-determination is not absolute. You can give your data to this type of company, but you can continue to exercise your right to delete at any point in time. So what you give, you can take away. And so these business models are founded on quite an unstable legal basis, because equally if the legal basis is consent, you can revoke consent. And it is not in many ways your data to give away because of that lack of ownership right. And so you see here that then there's a tension in the idea of informational self-determination, because on the one hand, it wants to facilitate autonomy of the individual and give individuals control over their data, but on the other hand, there are paternalistic limits to that control. And that, I think, is very much in keeping with the European human rights tradition. There's a great case about dwarf throwing that I won't go into. So, in addition, we, I think, will all be very familiar with a number of very practical limits to control over data. So, one example is the very lengthy terms and conditions that we encounter in the digital environment. And so you can pick your study to illustrate that this makes it improbable, if not implausible, for individuals to actually read privacy policies. But the Norwegian Consumer Council picked the 33 most popular consumer apps that individuals in Norway have on their phones, and if you have some time on your hands, you can visit YouTube or a similar streaming channel and see them read these aloud for 24 hours, where they said that if you took these terms and conditions, their combined length was longer than the New Testament. So again, unlikely that individuals are actually going to take the time to digest and to read these types of terms and conditions. We also have an increasing body of literature around the idea of dark patterns. And so here, again, the work of the Norwegian Consumer Council, which is an excellent report called Deceived by Design, and also the work of Privacy International in their recent report on this, is fantastic. So this is the idea that the way in which we are presented with choices in the digital environment often involves a very strong nudge in one direction, what Karen Young calls a hyper nudge. So where you have to click through to several screens in order to actually see which vendors are going to get access to your data and to change the cookie policy, for instance. Or where the accept button, normally it comes under some sort of sign saying, we value your privacy, except, in a big green flashing light, and then in small grey letters you can see reject. So these types of dark patterns make it, again, more difficult for individuals, not impossible, but more difficult for individuals to exercise informed choice. And then something which I'll come back to later, the way in which the internet ecosystem is currently structured makes it hard to avoid certain platforms. I was having a very nice lunch and I wanted to access some internet, and I found that the only way to access internet in this fantastic restaurant in Rio was to sign up through Facebook. It so happens that I am a conscientious objector when it comes to Facebook. But you can see that in these circumstances, a lot of our sign-ins in a digital context, a lot of our social interactions occur through platforms that are owned by very few enterprises. And so this has provoked a big debate that I'll talk about later. This was the subject of a speech given by the Competition Commissioner in the EU, Margrethe Vestager, who is about to become the Vice President of the European Commission, at a workshop in Cambridge earlier this year, where she said, data gives us power. Power we can use in good ways to save resources, to find new solutions, to help us live happier and more fulfilling lives. So this is an exciting moment. But it is also a moment when we have choices to make about who gets to use that power. And so in that speech, she discussed the consolidation of data power in the digital environment. Another factor that makes it more difficult for individuals to exercise control. And then we also see things like cookie walls. So this is the idea that if you don't want your personal data to be processed and you want to access some content online, that you need to consent to in order to access that content. So this Washington Post business model attracted a lot of attention in Europe and a huge debate following the entry into force of the GDPR. Because we all know that digital content, in particular high quality journalism, is not free. Yet, we have become accustomed to free in the digital environment, and so here they gave users a choice. You could have this content without paying a monetary price, but the quid pro quo for that was that you gave them access to your data, and they were allowed to process your personal data. Or you could pay for a basic subscription which involved less data processing. And the reason why this provoked such fierce debate was, on the one hand, people said, well, this is just a market response to the legislation. Others said, well, this is making people pay for a fundamental right. So if the quantity of data that they extract for the free service is excessive, then in order to avoid that, you are basically paying for protection of a fundamental right. And so this is a debate which kind of rages on. And so in the academic literature, you have some researchers in the Netherlands, in particular Frederick Borgesius, who's an expert in all things online advertising, saying that the GDPR doesn't in fact ban these types of tracking walls. However, he and colleagues argue that it should in particular circumstances. And so they say if you're dealing with a dominant company, if you're dealing with a monopoly, then services shouldn't be offered on a take it or leave it basis. Or if you're dealing with vulnerable individuals, so for instance, a national healthcare service requiring that you have tracking in order to get advice around drug addiction or something similar, or gambling addiction, whatever it is, in those circumstances, this type of unconditional processing shouldn't be allowed. But this is about to become a very hot topic in the EU, and the reason for that is if you look at the wording of the GDPR, it actually tries to address this, but in doing so I think it makes a mess of it because it's not very clear. So it says, like the Brazilian laws, that consent has to be informed, it has to be specific, and it has to be freely given. And the question with something like this, is this freely given consent? Can we say it's freely given consent? And what the GDPR says about that is, when you are assessing whether consent is freely given, you have to take utmost account of whether or not that consent, or the performance of a contract, so access to something like the Washington Post, is made conditional on giving that consent. So we're about to face a situation where a court will have to decide how much data is necessary for the performance of a contract. Is it kind of all the data? Will we place no limits on this? Or will we say this amount of data is a reasonable profit or a reasonable return on investment for the service that you are providing? It so happens that this is a question that is pending before the European Court of Justice at this moment. And I think this is interesting for a few reasons. This is interesting because it's 2019 and we've had data protection rules in the EU since 1995, and it's taken us this long to ask this question. But I think it's also interesting because the advisor to the court, the Advocate General, explicitly endorses the idea that data is payment in the digital environment, which I think will upset those looking at this from a fundamental rights perspective, but also in the context of this case. So let me just explain this case to you briefly. This was a case about a free online lottery service. So the prize wasn't particularly significant, so it was free online, and if you signed up to the lottery service, there was one box in particular that you had to click in order to gain access to the lottery. And by clicking on that box, you consented to either choosing 30 commercial partners from a list of 57 who would contact you by email or by post or by phone, or if you didn't bother to choose the 30 partners you would hear from, the company would choose, the company Planet 49 running the lottery would choose them for you. So the quid pro quo for access to the lottery was giving your data to 30 commercial companies. And so what does the Advocate General say about this? Well, he says, we have to keep in mind that the underlying purpose of participation in the lottery is the selling of personal data. In other words, it is the providing of personal data which constitutes the main obligation of users to participate in the lottery. And so he thinks that in this situation, the processing of the personal data is necessary to participate in the lottery. However, I think we could discuss the proportionality of asking for your contact details to be given to 30 providers to enter into the chance, a lottery, to obtain quite a small prize. But he doesn't engage in that analysis at all. So it's questionable how protective this supposedly robust new principle on consent will be. So you can see that all of these mechanisms are then putting pressure on control over personal data. And so there are those practical limitations to informational self-determination, but there are also normative or conceptual limitations to control over personal data. And the most obvious one is the balancing of data protection rights and the individual's right to control their information with freedom of expression. And you see this made clear in the right to be forgotten, or the right to delete, as I think it should more accurately be referred. And so in a recent case in the UK, called NT1 and NT2, you could see that the court in the UK said these two rights have to be put on the same scale, put on the scales with the same weight. One doesn't trump or prevail over the other. So it says the balancing exercise in any individual delisting case, so to remove information from a search result, is to be entered into with the scales in equal balance. And so you can see that if you gave individuals absolute control over personal data, that equal balancing wouldn't be possible. Another limit, another conceptual limit to individual control over personal data stems from the fact that that doesn't recognize group privacy. It doesn't recognize the fact that data can relate to many individuals simultaneously. So you think of something as obvious as a joint bank account, or perhaps even more prosaically, a telephone call. The metadata about that telephone call doesn't just relate to one individual, it relates to two. So the more control you give individuals over their information, the more clashes and tensions you're going to have over these competing claims for that personal data. And I think Lynette Taylor talks about, so there's been some fantastic work done on group privacy, but Lynette Taylor in the Netherlands has been one of the pioneers here. And she kind of argues that technologies, new technologies, sort, profile, and inform action based on groups. Based on group dynamics. Are you wealthy? Are you educated? Are you Are you likely to have a heart attack? Are you interested in travel? So we're sorted and profiled into groups rather than necessarily profiled at an individual level. And so she argues that in order to operationalize or put in place any meaningful concept of data justice, we have to look beyond the individual. And so what I'm suggesting is that legislation that kind of consolidates the role of the individual ignores this collective dimension. And again, I think portability is, as I said, a great example of this. I'm running short on time, so I won't go into this in much detail, but just to highlight one or two things. Portability, including data portability, depends on the initiative of the individual. And in other areas of law, for instance, utilities, gas, electricity, we have quite a bit of empirical evidence to now show that it is people who have sufficient income who tend to actually switch and move between providers, and that those who have less income pay a kind of a poverty premium by not switching. And so there is a query here about what will happen with data protection. If we have data portability, will it be those informed, savvy consumers, well-educated, with resources, financial and time on their hands, that exercise this right, rather than the general population? So who will this benefit? So it's a very individualized approach to protection. And then we also have some feasibility challenges. So as I said, just even carving out your personal data from somebody else's personal data if you want to port it from one service provider to another. Another thing I noted about the Brazilian law when compared to the GDPR is that the right to data portability is in many ways broader because it applies to all data, whereas the EU law only applies to data that is provided by the individual. But we can perhaps talk about that later. Sorry. And so here, what I wanted to show you in too much time is the limits, or are the limits of individual control over personal data. As I said, I'm following in a long line of academics to discuss this, but I think Julie Cohn, a US academic, has put this very nicely when she says, we need to turn privacy inside out. So she said, privacy rights are supposed to protect individual subjects, and so conventional ways of understanding privacy are very subject-centered, but these subject-centered approaches wrestle with these deeply embedded contradictions that I've been talking about. And so privacy's most enduring institutional failure is to not recognize this. So I want to just kind of pick up on that and highlight some ways in which we can move past this individualistic approach to data protection and ensure effective data protection through more collective mechanisms, through more systemic rather than collective mechanisms. So if we shift away from the individual, that's not to say that you remove the individual from the picture, it's just that you take the emphasis or the responsibility off the individual for protecting their rights. I think you can recalibrate or make this shift in two ways. One is internal to data protection law, and you can do that in a number of ways. We could, for instance, have narrower data protection laws, more focused on particular harms, for instance, or more focused on particular types of data processing operations. And that might lead to more effective rights, and I'll point you to the debate on this at the moment. We could introduce a new layer of regulatory techniques, as we've done, around accountability and risk. Or we could see stronger enforcement. And as I said, this has been the big problem in Europe. And some of that has been rectified by the GDPR. So, for instance, the fragmentation of the application of the rules may be rectified by the creation of a new EU-level agency, which can issue binding decisions. And that won't be an issue in Brazil because you will hopefully have a centralized authority. But also other things around sanctions and selective enforcement. But looking beyond data protection, we could also see a role for other areas of law, as I said, like competition law. So the first thing to consider is whether or not our data protection laws are too broad. And as a result, that makes them very difficult to enforce. And this is an argument that is being increasingly made in the EU. So Nadia Portova, a scholar in the Netherlands, has called data protection the law of everything. So she says the problem is that in the circumstances where all data is personal data, because the definition of personal data is so broad, any information relating to somebody who is identified or identifiable, so almost identical to the Brazilian definition, this triggers data protection law. And then you have a whole raft of obligations that then apply that are not necessarily scalable in terms of how they apply in practice. And so she says the result is that the GDPR can't then be applied in a meaningful way. What is interesting is that this is now being considered again before the Court of Justice of the EU. So we have a case pending called GC and others. So it's a whole eight individuals from France, all of whom have had their sensitive personal data returned as search results in Google's search engine. And so they argue that when their sensitive data appears in Google's search engine, this is Google processing sensitive data, and that it needs to either obtain their explicit consent, which it hasn't done, or have one of the other more restrictive justifications for processing sensitive data. So the Brazilian law, like the GDPR, contains more restrictive provisions for sensitive data. And the question is, how could Google search engine continue to do what it does by distinguishing between sensitive personal data and non-sensitive personal data? When something like an image can contain sensitive personal data, of course. So what has the court said about this? Well, the court hasn't had the opportunity to discuss it yet, but again, the advisor to the court is recommending something quite unusual. So he says, when the directive was drafted in 1995, search engines weren't kind of present in the legislator's mind. And so its provisions do not lend themselves to an intuitive and purely literal application to search engines. Okay, let's forget the fact that the GDPR was enacted in 2016 when search engines did exist. So he argues that we can't take an all or nothing approach to the application of data protection rules to search engines. So he says it is necessary to examine each provision from the aspect or from the perspective of whether or not it is capable of being applied to search engines. So this is really quite interesting. What he is proposing is that you go through the law provision by provision and say, can this provision meaningfully apply to that data controller? You can imagine the immediate objections. This renders the application of the law quite uncertain. Yet, he's trying to deal with the practical problem, which is that the business model doesn't fit with the law because of the law's broad scope and restrictive provisions. Similarly, we've seen the concept of data controller, which also exists in the Brazilian law, interpreted very expansively. So one recent example is in a case called Facebook fan pages, where the operators of a fan page on Facebook, so where businesses, for instance, can connect with consumers, or local swimming club can connect with members of the club, or whatever it is, have been deemed to be joint controllers for the purposes of data protection law. So co-responsible with Facebook for the application of the data protection rules. And the justification given by the court for this was that the fan page received data analytics from Facebook, and it chose what type of data analytics it wanted. So do you want information on gender? Do you want information on age? Do you want information on geographic location? What kind of aggregate information would you like? And so as a result, it became a co-controller. But this, again, has led an advocate general at the court to say, will effective protection be enhanced if everyone is responsible for ensuring it? So the more people we make responsible under the law, the less effective the law might become. And so what he says, and this is really quite a striking opinion because he's very critical, he says that the conceptual lack of clarity upstream about who is a data controller and with regard to what aspect of the data processing activities, is leading to a lack of clarity downstream for individuals about where they can exercise their rights. And he says this crosses into the realm of actual impossibility. So you now have members of the European Court of Justice talking about the actual impossibility of applying this law. Keeping in mind that's the law that has been broadly replicated, not simply in Brazil, but globally. And so we're going to need to have a more sustained conversation about the scope of application of this law and whether or not it delivers effective data protection. So one thing we could do is reconsider the scope. Another thing we could do, more mundane, is emphasize the responsibilities of controllers through what has been called meta-regulation. So not co-regulation, but the idea that controllers take responsibility to comply with the rules and that then they can demonstrate that compliance. And in order to make this really effective, you would want to have that compliance demonstrated not simply to authorities, but also to interested members of civil society, to interested members of the public, to interested stakeholders. I'm really running out of time, so I'm not going to go into that, but you can see that this has been introduced in the GDPR, in the Brazilian law, and you also see references to risk, that you should in some ways calibrate the extent of your obligations, what measures you take to ensure data protection compliance, by taking into account what type of risk the data processing operation will entail. So I think what you can see here with the introduction of accountability and risk is an attempt to address the problem of the broad scope of the law. So you're trying to introduce scalable obligations, but not necessarily labeling it as such. But I think most importantly in the EU context at least, and I can imagine it will be the same here, is enforcement of the law. Because globally we have seen a huge proliferation of data protection laws, but many of them haven't been enforced. And I think the same stands true for the European Union, which is looked at as, I guess, one of the leaders in this area. Why hasn't it been enforced? Well, inadequate resources, limited and fragmented regulatory actions, and in some situations, regulatory competition between the states, where everyone wants to regulate particular actors, in particular the big tech companies. Up until now, we've seen a limited role of civil society, although I think that will change. And the idea of selective enforcement is still quite contested. So the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, keeping in mind that in Europe, most of the tech companies are based in Ireland, so that would have the lead for investigating data protection compliance. She got in a lot of, was subject to a lot of criticism for speaking about digital ambulance chasers. So she said, that her office had been inundated with requests for declaratory statements that the law had been violated. Even when the data processing infringement had ceased, the data controller had recognized that they had been in the wrong, but people wanted these declaratory judgments, and she had to, through her mandate, look at each and every complaint and investigate each and every complaint. So she didn't have the opportunity to engage in selective enforcement. And so she said that this was dragging attention away from the large-scale systemic breaches that were affecting a vast swathe of the population to focus on these smaller individual complaints. And I think that's an issue that is, again, currently being discussed in Europe. Should we be selective in order to be more effective in the enforcement capacity? Something which is already, I think, very well established in Brazil but is not in Europe is the idea of collective redress. So the possibility for civil society actors to take litigation on behalf of individuals. And this is now something that the GDPR introduces. So just very briefly, what you can see there are three mechanisms to potentially shift the emphasis in data protection law away from individual control towards more effective data protection. but those mechanisms are internal to the law. What I want to do with my last 5 minutes is to just highlight an ongoing discussion about mechanisms beyond data protection law that can actually help individuals have more effective data protection rights. And so across the world, I think it's accurate to say, so this week we've had a report from the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, we've had reports from the FTC in the US, and earlier this year we've had a report both from the EU and the UK Competition and Markets Authority. You see that competition authorities are becoming more and more interested in competition in data-driven markets. So you might be saying, how is this in any way relevant to data protection and privacy? Well, I think if you go back to what I mentioned earlier, the consolidation of data in the hands of fewer and fewer actors online, you can see that we are, I think, in a situation of data power, where a handful of commercial enterprises hold an awful lot of data, and with that data, they can both potentially gain a competitive advantage, but also have power over individuals because data is power. And so the question is, how did we get here? How have we ended up with a consolidation of data in the hands of very few actors? And here we can point to a number of factors, and I'm happy to discuss these in Q&A, but the one I want to talk about is mergers and acquisitions. So since 2009, we have seen a huge number, up to 4 or 5 a week, of acquisitions by a handful of digital actors of nascent startups. So some of the most famous are, for instance, Google's acquisition of Nest, the home heating device for the Internet of Things. And if you look at this type of transaction, it's not something that would attract the attention of a competition authority. Why? Because a competition authority would say, well, Google is an online operator with a search engine, with Gmail, or whatever it is, and Nest is a home heating device. And so if these two companies merge, this doesn't reduce competition because they're not competing at the moment. Nest is a home heating device that is not competing with Google's search engine. And so in this way, these transactions have kind of flown under the radar to a significant extent, with some exceptions. So one that did attract quite a lot of attention was Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp. Keeping in mind that this occurred after Facebook's acquisition of Instagram and Lenovo and various other potential competitors. And so this transaction was brought to the attention of the European Commission, and the European Commission passed the merger, or approved the merger, while attaching no conditions. And its logic was that on the relevant markets, and they were social networking, where WhatsApp wasn't relevant or wasn't active, only Facebook was. Online advertising, where WhatsApp wasn't active, only Facebook was. And consumer communications. These guys were not direct competitors. And in the market where they were direct competitors, so consumer communications, the fact that WhatsApp was acquired by Facebook didn't limit competition because sufficient competition still existed. The logic of the Commission was that consumers multi-home. We don't just have one app on our phones for communication, we tend to have several on our phones, and therefore this acquisition wasn't problematic. However, several competition scholars, in particular Ariel Ezraki at the University of Oxford, have argued that the Commission kind of missed the point here. What fell in the blind spot of the Commission's analysis was the data, was the potential for WhatsApp and Facebook to aggregate the data. And of course, Facebook gave the European Commission information to suggest that it wasn't technically possible for it to merge this data. And then it transpired that it was technically possible for it to merge this data, and it was fined by the European Commission, but the deal was done, quite literally. So why do I mention this in a data protection context? Well, when individuals were asked to express their choice as to whether or not they wanted to have their WhatsApp data transferred to Facebook, this was the dark pattern that was encountered. And I take this from Pat Walsh, a privacy consultant in the UK for a group called Privacy Matters. And Pat Walsh had kind of gone through the options that were given to individuals, and you can see here that the language is quite unclear. Your information will be shared with the Facebook family of companies. This will be some of your account information, your phone number. And for any of you that are users of Facebook, you might know that unless you download the Messenger app on your phone, you don't necessarily have to hand over your phone number. Your phone number is not necessarily information you provide. So what this allowed was the merger of details about your, dare I say it, real friends, who your actual contacts were, what their numbers are, who you're actually in touch with your Facebook friends, which is a big missing piece of the picture that was allowed through this transaction. And so what I'm suggesting here is that by looking at these mergers from a purely competition perspective, we're missing part of the story. And we're allowing for the further consolidation of the digital environment in a way that renders it even more difficult for data protection law to be effective. And just one last thing to highlight on this. Sorry, I'll flick through this a bit more quickly. But another way in which competition law is starting to think about data protection is as part of the general backdrop to these types of mergers. So in Microsoft's acquisition of LinkedIn, but also in an earlier merger or acquisition by Google of a French healthcare company called Sanofi, the Commission said, well, the merger of the data isn't a problem. Why? Because individuals have data portability. So you can see what's happening here. So if you look at this quote, this is from the European Commission decision in Google Sanofi. The Commission says, the lack of ability to lock in patients' sensitive personal data by limiting or preventing the portability of their data won't be possible given that GDPR gives users the right to have their data ported to another company. So what we're saying is let them merge, let Google acquire the healthcare company because individuals can then port their data afterwards. So you can see competition law putting pressure on individual control over personal data. I'm not kind of arguing that competition law should be used to solve data protection problems. What I'm arguing is that competition law shouldn't create data protection problems. And I think that's a subtle but important difference. So how could competition law do this? Well, it could, when looking at media mergers, it could look at data protection as an element of the overall quality of a product. So it could say if you allow these companies to merge, we'll see less choice on the market and lower quality products because privacy-preserving products might disappear in this process. But equally, I think another way in which we could look at this that has been considered in the UK is to look at data-driven mergers separately to the competition analysis. So you see this for media mergers in the context of journalism. So if two newspapers want to merge, there's a competition assessment of the merger to see what impact the transaction has on competition. But there is also, in some circumstances, a parallel assessment of the impact of the merger on freedom of speech and media plurality. And that is designed to protect fundamental rights in the competitive process. And so what we could start to consider is a similar data protection assessment or privacy assessment of these types of data-driven mergers in order to promote the rights to data protection and privacy. So what I've argued for too long is that individual control is a necessary part of data protection legislation. But looking in the rearview mirror in Europe, what you can see is that it has not been sufficient. So it needs to be coupled with active civil society and collective redress and active enforcement of the data protection rules. This might also lead us to consider the scope of the rules and whether and how we can more effectively enforce. So would we have more effective enforcement if the scope of the rules were narrower? The other part of the picture, which I think we can no longer ignore though, is the role of competition in data-driven markets and the impact that the lack of competition upstream is having on the effectiveness of data protection rights downstream. So I'll be looking forward to discussing that puzzle with you. The last thing I want to say is that I'm one of the editors of a journal called International Data Privacy Law, and as the title suggests, it's an international data privacy journal published by Oxford University Press, and we are very much hoping to get more contributions from beyond the EU and the US, so we would very much welcome contributions from people attending here today. And if you want to contact me, my email address is there, or you can find me online. So thank you.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much.
Shall we open for questions? You may address your questions by the app or here in person. As I'm the moderator, I will warm up the discussion while people are getting prepared for addressing their questions. I'd like to thank you, Orla, for such a rich and brilliant talk. Everything you have raised here, I will highlight some of them. I'll highlight two of them, which is all these problems that we see in the European and Brazilian law, where, first of all, data flow is under some sort of control, and second, that this control will lie over someone's hands. So we have problematic issues which go beyond data protection law from a traditional standpoint, the collective redress or public civil actions in Brazil. We have some mechanisms which they have some sort of tradition in Brazil that may help in expanding that. Before I go straight to my question about competition law, I'd like to know if anyone has a question or if I can be the first one. No, we have a question. Good morning, my name is Marta. I work in the Citizenship Minister, where there is a file with over 70 million subjects with their personal information, such as school education, address. This is a file which is fed by over 100 municipalities, managed by the state, federal districts, and that is shared to several social programs, several utility agencies, public contests. And now I ask myself, from a federal ministry standpoint, what does it mean to have personal data protection as number of users, number of people who feed this database, and the need to share information about vulnerable people with so many people? And when you say, well, someone will be liable for that, just one person, and who will be that person? And if many, how? That represents a problem. And when you say, I do not know if that law can be applied, I do not know myself, and that's the reason why I'm here, to learn a little bit more from you. Thank you. Do you have any specific question? No, actually, it's not really a specific question. I'm just raising that fact. Is the law applied for a situation, for a scenario like ours? I'm talking about here on behalf of the ministry, where we have over 6,000 people working and handling that database, and many others that use that database, when we have information about over 7 million people.
So this is quite a difficult issue, the extent to which states can create this type of database. And I guess the database is created, again, without consent, because consent is not appropriate in these circumstances, but in the public interest. What I would want to know is what the stated purposes of the database are. So why was this information initially collected, and what are its stated purposes now? However, so it's hard to kind of say in the abstract. What I would say is you have seen challenges to this type of database for instance, in India, a very famous challenge in recent years against the Aadhaar database, which was a similar public service database, where it went to the Indian Supreme Court, and by relying on the right to privacy rather than on kind of data protection legislation as such, the database in its entirety was deemed to be illegal. The first fines in Europe have been imposed, or the first finding of a breach of the GDPR by the Irish Data Protection Commissioner has in fact been in relation to a similar database in Ireland. And so we have a public services card, which if you want to access certain public services, so in particular if you're a vulnerable member of society and you want to access benefits, you have to have one of these cards. And there was an attempt to use that database to create a general database of the country. So if you wanted to apply for a passport or an ID card, you had to go through that database. And what is interesting is, at that point, the Data Protection Commissioner declared the database to be illegal because it went beyond its stated purposes, and I think they relied on the principle of fairness, but I would need to check. However, that is currently being appealed. So what you see here is one of the challenges, I think, with data protection legislation, which is that it is a very permissive regime. If you can show you have a legal basis for processing, and that can be something as broad as public interest, and if you can show that, for instance, you process the data for compatible purposes with your stated objectives, and that could be to ensure the fair or accurate distribution of benefits, for instance, then data protection law doesn't necessarily prohibit that. It's simply a regime that puts in place some safeguards. But those safeguards aren't completely insignificant. What you should have for that type of database is an impact assessment, for instance. Consideration of the impact, the risks of having that type of database, and the impact that that would have on consumers, or on citizens rather than consumers in this context. So Bruno's working on this stuff rather than me, but those types of safeguards might be helpful, but data protection law of itself, I don't think will necessarily prohibit this. Yeah.
Thank you, Orla. Alguma outra pergunta? Orla, I'd like to ask you something. If you could please develop a little bit more on possible intersections between data protection law and competition law. Yeah. In particular, intellectual property and trade secrets. What's on your thoughts about that? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So if we, in terms of the relationship between data protection and intellectual property remains something that, again, despite 25 years of law in Europe, there's very little written on, and we have very little jurisprudence. We have some things with regard to copyright infringement by individuals, but nothing about the trade secrets, for instance, of a company. So what impact would portability, for instance, have on intellectual property? If you look at the GDPR, it says that it is without prejudice to the intellectual property rights of the data controller, but how that will be managed in practice, we simply don't know. Where you see most of the emphasis on, when we're thinking of about that interaction between data protection and competition law, is either in the context of mergers, as I briefly mentioned, or in the context of abuses of market position or abuses of market power. And so this is quite controversial. The idea in competition law is that if you have a position, a monopoly position in a market or a high market share, then special responsibilities attach to you as a commercial entity. And so this means that your behaviour, certain acts that you commit or acts that you undertake will be illegal, even though if you didn't have a position of market power, they would be completely lawful. And in Germany, what we've seen recently is an attempt by the competition authority in Germany to argue that Facebook is dominant in the market for social networking services, so it has a position of market power, and that it has abused that position of market power by effectively not complying with the data protection rules. So what had been happening with Facebook in Germany was that non-Facebook users were having some of their data transmitted to Facebook when they visited websites with the Facebook plugin or the like kind of thumbs up attached in the web page, and that data was being transmitted back to Facebook. And so the argument was this was not something where consent had been obtained, and this was not transparent to users. And so the German Competition Authority opted to take that as a competition case rather than as a data protection case. So competition lawyers are very divided on this. Some see it as an evolution of the law, and some see it as a distortion of the founding principles of competition law. I think if it's misused, so to simply say a breach of data protection is a breach of competition would be incorrect. However, I do think there are circumstances where the two legal frameworks overlap and where it might actually be more effective to use competition law as a tool rather than data protection. Because it's a bit more flexible, because the sanctions are higher. Is that in some way in bad faith? I don't think so. I think it's just you've got two legal frameworks that can apply to the same issue. I think we encounter that quite a lot as lawyers. And I think the way to argue that is to say, as I said, that competition law is about price, but it is also about ensuring more choice for consumers and better quality products. And if you have a dominant company acting in a way that stamps out choice or that reduces the quality of products, then that is a competition issue as well as a data protection issue. Of course, from an institutional perspective, you couldn't prosecute both, and so these things still need to be ironed out, but that's kind of how I would see the relationship developing.
For how long has the European Union fostering public policies and public policies related to data protection and internet? And in your opinion, what is the maturity level of legal courts about law enforcement in the European scenario? And if there is any level of legal insecurity and how to deal with self-determination in that sense?
Few questions in there, so I'll take kind of the first, or I'll kind of try and address the first part of it. So data protection is a bit of an odd policy in the EU because initially the EU didn't want to legislate in this area. And as I mentioned at a seminar yesterday, the EU has no competence to proactively introduce fundamental rights instruments. So the Charter means that it can't breach fundamental rights, but it has no competence to introduce fundamental rights legislation, which might then lead you to say, well, how do we have data protection legislation? The answer to that is that this was introduced as with an economic justification. The argument was that if some EU member states had data protection legislation and if others didn't, this would act as an impediment to the free flow of personal data between those states. And so the EU harmonized and introduced a minimum level of data protection across Europe to ensure that data could flow freely. And that was in 1995. What is interesting, I think, is that in 1995, the free flow of data was kind of ancillary to, or kind of complementary to, other elements of free trade or free movement, like the free movement of workers. So if you were a worker who moved from France to Italy, your data could go with you. But data itself was not a commodity. So I think what has changed now is that data has itself become the commodity. And so it's not simply flowing in an ancillary way. We want data to flow because it has value in and of itself. So this began as an economic policy, but with the introduction of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and with several very, very strong judgments from the European Court of Justice, I think it has moved very much from being an economic policy to becoming something more like a fundamental rights policy. From an international perspective, I think that's quite interesting because this could raise international trade issues. You know, is this a protectionist policy, for instance? That's one question that's been asked. And you have provisions in the GATS at the WTO dealing with that, but we haven't kind of seen this litigated or thrashed out properly yet. So I think I started working on data protection a decade ago now, and when I started to write about it, there were very few judgments. It was quite nice, because there were 10 judgments, so there was not much reading, but also just went to show that the law hadn't really been applied. As you probably gathered from the slides today, over the past few months, we've had a huge flurry of judgments. So the maturity of the EU courts is about to, I think, really exponentially increase. I think we're about to have an awful lot more jurisprudence at EU level. We still don't have very much jurisprudence, though, at national level, because of a lack of awareness of the law, because a lot of the rights were given to individuals and there was nobody to help them to exercise them, and because consumer protection and non-profit organisations weren't really well versed in data protection. But again, I think that's changing. So I think we'll see a lot more activism and private litigation at national level as well.
Hi, Orla. Thanks for the terrific lecture, and thanks for coming as well. My question is about this new shape of regulatory mentality in the field of data protection, which is meta-regulation, as you said. And I'd like to hear your thoughts more about this dynamic, this regulatory dynamic, let's say. Meta-regulation puts a lot of faith in the actions of data controller. So basically, who is going to process personal data is the first one that is going to raise the voice regarding how to manage, how to recognize, and how to mitigate the risks of data processing. And one of the best examples of that is data protection impact assessment, but also regarding the legal base for lawful data processing, such as legitimate interest and also regarding the legitimate interest assessment. So when you are talking about this, we are talking just about the content of the regulation, but also have to take in consideration the context of the regulation. And in this sense, when you quote the professor Julia Cohen that says that you have to take into account the institution design that is going to put this legislation, this law in movement, do you think, taking into consideration the EU scenario and also regarding to development countries, this meta-regulation at the end of the day is going to reinforce the asymmetry of information and reinforce the asymmetry of power, or is going to find a balance and to reduce the asymmetry of information and reduce the asymmetry of power?
Nice, easy question. The honest answer is I don't know. I think we could be, so I'm struggling to find any kind of consensus in the academic literature, at least, about the effectiveness of these principles. And in some ways, it's also very difficult to gauge without a lot of research on the ground. And as I said, these principles are new to the European framework as well. And I think in other legal frameworks where you have, for instance, accountability as a principle, so where it's very well established, if I think of the APEC legal framework, the Asia Pacific legal framework, you see that there's a principle of accountability, but no enforcement. So I don't think that's a good comparator. So one answer, I think, is we'll need to see a little bit of, with a little bit of time. If we were to be cynical about the new elements of meta-regulation, and I think Lee Bygrave addresses this very nicely in a lecture which you can see online, which he delivered at Tilt in the Netherlands this year. He says that it could be just an empty compliance measure, because what we saw in Europe, and I'll be interested to hear where this happens in Brazil, after the introduction of GDPR was, and just prior to the introduction of GDPR, was an explosion in the number of experts in data protection around offering consultancy and certification mechanisms and all of these things in order to ensure data protection compliance. Whether or not that kind of cottage industry of expertise around these regulatory techniques, which controllers might not know how to implement, like an impact assessment or audits of that type. You know, these will be new things for data controllers. Whether or not that improves data protection, I don't know. There are some elements of the meta-regulation in the GDPR that have been quite heavily criticized. So, for instance, I would have thought instinctively that something like data protection by design would be something that would be quite well received. However, so that's the idea that was mentioned in the introduction today, that that at the very outset, when you were designing technologies, you design them in a way that embeds respect for data protection principles. For me, that seems like something quite beneficial, because you make this a more interdisciplinary conversation. We try and identify ways in which technology can actually implement the rules, and we don't think about data protection as an afterthought. You're thinking about it from the beginning. However, again, two professors in the Netherlands, Ronald Linus and Bert Jacobs, who are very well known in the field, have been very critical of this by saying that privacy simply cannot be hard-coded. It's not something that you code. It's an organizational issue. And rather than kind of trying to embed it from a technological perspective, you need to try and get organizational mentalities to change around data protection. So I think genuinely that's the benefit, or the potential benefit, of this type of meta-regulation. If you can get people in boardrooms, in high management, thinking about data protection as a right or as a risk, whichever, it doesn't really matter as long as they're thinking about it, then you know, it could be useful in that way, but I just don't think we know yet. And I don't know how you would measure that in an easy way.
I would like to thank, first of all, Orla, for your kindness, for being here. This Q&A session was very profitable. Thank you so much for your attendance. Now we'll have 15 minutes coffee break outside, and then we get back. Thank you.